They tell us medieval warfare was simple. Swords slashed, bows sang, knights charged in shining lines. That story is comforting. It is also wrong, because if steel blades and arrows were truly enough, medieval battlefields would not be littered with shattered armor, crushed skulls, and weapons that look more like industrial tools than heroic relics. Somewhere between museums and movies, an entire category of medieval weaponry vanished from memory, not because it was ineffective, but because it was too effective for the myths we like to tell. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Once armor evolved, swords and arrows stopped being reliable killers, and medieval warriors adapted in ways that modern imagination prefers to forget. This story is not about swords. It is not about bows. It is about 5 medieval weapons that solved a problem no blade could, by turning physics, trauma, and terror into instruments of war. But first, we need to break a belief. The belief that never made sense. Popular culture teaches that medieval battles were contests of skill, blade against blade, strength against strength. The better swordsman wins, the sharper steel prevails. Yet historical records, battlefield remains, and surviving armor tell a different story. By the late Middle Ages, a well-equipped knight was wrapped in layered protection, mail over padding, plate over joints, steel curved to deflect cuts. Against such defenses, slashing weapons failed more often than they succeeded. Even arrows struggled unless fired at close range or from specialized bows. So medieval soldiers asked a brutal question. If cutting doesn't work, what does? The answer reshaped warfare. Not elegance, not finesse. Impact, penetration, trauma. And from that answer emerged weapons that modern storytelling quietly ignores. Weapon 1, the warhammer. When cutting became obsolete. The medieval warhammer looks deceptively simple. A short haft, a compact head. One side blunt, the other shaped into a spike. But simplicity was the point. Against plate armor, cutting was wasted energy. A sword could strike perfectly and still glance off curved steel. The warhammer didn't care about sharpness. It cared about force concentration. A hammer strike transferred kinetic energy directly through armor into bone. Even without breaking steel, it shattered wrists, crushed collarbones, and turned ribs into weapons against lungs. The spike, meanwhile, targeted weak points, visors, joints, the gaps under arms. Contemporary accounts describe knights being felled without visible wounds. Archaeological finds show armor dented inward, bones fractured beneath intact steel. The warhammer did not kill gloriously. It killed efficiently, which is precisely why it disappeared from heroic narratives. Weapon 2. The holy water sprinkler. Faith as psychological warfare. At first glance, it looks ceremonial. A mace-like weapon with a spiked ball chained to a handle, its head studded like a grotesque rosary. Its name, the holy water sprinkler, was not ironic. This weapon turned motion into terror. The flexible chain allowed the spiked head to arc unpredictably, bypassing shields and striking from angles defenders couldn't read. Unlike rigid weapons, blocking it was dangerous. The head could wrap, rebound, and strike again, but its real power was psychological. A charging soldier swinging a spiked flail created chaos in tight formations. The sound alone, metal whistling, spikes cracking armor, shattered morale. Infantry formations broke not because they were defeated, but because they panicked. In medieval warfare, fear killed as effectively as steel. And this weapon specialized in fear. Weapon 3. The Morning Star. Blunt force without mercy. The Morning Star is often confused with the flail, but it is something more brutal. No chain, no flexibility, just a solid haft capped with a spiked head. This design removed unpredictability and replaced it with certainty. Every strike landed exactly where aimed, delivering both blunt trauma and puncture damage. Against helmets, the spikes focused force into narrow points. Against limbs, bones snapped. What made the Morning Star particularly feared was its accessibility. Unlike swords, which required training and metallurgy, this weapon could be produced quickly and wielded effectively by infantry and militias. It was the democratization of armor-cracking violence, which made it a threat not just to knights, but to social hierarchy itself. Weapon 4, the bec de Corbin, engineering against the human body. Translated loosely as crow's beak, the bec de Corbin represents medieval weapons at their most calculated. This polearm combined 3 functions: a hammer face to crush a spike to pierce a long haft to control distance. It was designed not for duels, but for killing armored elites on foot. Manuals from the period show fighters hooking knights behind knees, tearing them to the ground, then driving the beak through visors or into armpits. This was not chaos. It was systematized violence. The bec de Corbin reflects a moment when medieval warfare stopped pretending to be chivalric and admitted what it had become: applied biomechanics. Weapon 5, the Goydendog, the end of the knightly monopoly. The Goydendog was ugly. A thick wooden staff reinforced with metal bands topped with a spike. It lacked elegance. It lacked prestige, and it changed history. Used famously by Flemish militias, the Goydendog was devastating against cavalry. The spike stopped charging horses. The heavy shaft finished riders once they fell. It required minimal training and minimal cost. For the first time, armored knights faced mass-produced, purpose-built anti-elite weapons wielded by commoners. The battlefield balance shifted, and with it, the social order. The pattern we were never meant to see. These weapons share something deeper than design. They represent a moment when medieval society stopped romanticizing war and started solving it. When cutting failed, they crushed. When armor adapted, they adapted faster. When elites dominated, they leveled the field. So why don't we remember them? Because they undermine the story we like, that history is driven by noble heroes wielding elegant tools. These weapons tell a darker truth, that progress often comes from abandoning beauty in favor of function. In the next part, we will ask the uncomfortable question this evidence forces upon us. What else about medieval warfare and medieval knowledge have we chosen to forget? Once you see these weapons clearly, a disturbing realization follows. They were not experimental. They were not rare. They were not mistakes. They were solutions, which means medieval warfare had already accepted a truth that modern retellings refuse to acknowledge. Once armor reached a certain threshold, traditional weapons became inefficient, and inefficient tools do not survive long on real battlefields. So the question is no longer why these weapons existed. The real question is, why did we forget them? The myth of chivalry versus the reality of survival. By the 14th and 15th centuries, chivalric ideals were already collapsing under technological pressure. Knights still spoke of honor, but they trained for survival. Manuals from the period, fight books, battlefield treatises, and instructional illustrations show techniques that are disturbingly practical. No flowing sword arcs, no cinematic duels. Instead, hooking limbs, breaking joints, crushing helmets, finishing grounded opponents. Weapons like the bec de Corbin and warhammer were paired with tactics designed to neutralize armor, not admire it. Once a knight was dismounted, mercy became optional. Battlefields were not theaters, they were systems, and these forgotten weapons were optimized components. Armor didn't fail. The body. Did modern audiences assume armor was defeated when weapons improved? That assumption is wrong. Armor did exactly what it was designed to do: stop cuts, deflect blows, resist penetration. What it could not do was stop physics. Blunt force weapons exploited a biological limit. Human bodies cannot absorb sudden energy transfer without catastrophic internal damage. Even if steel remained intact, organs ruptured, bones fractured, and nervous systems shut down. This is why medieval skeletons often show trauma patterns without corresponding penetration marks. The weapon didn't need to get inside the armor, it only needed to get through the body's tolerance. Why swords stayed in the spotlight? If these weapons were so effective, why do swords dominate memory? Because swords symbolized status. They were expensive, labor-intensive, and legally restricted in many regions. Owning a sword meant belonging to a social class. Warhammers, maces, and Godin dogs were tools of function, not identity. History tends to preserve symbols, not solutions. Art favored swords because patrons were knights. Chronicles glorified blades because blades represented lineage. But battlefield archaeology tells a quieter story, one of crushed skulls, snapped vertebrae, and weapons built to end fights quickly. The winners wrote the songs. The survivors wrote the manuals. The infantry revolution, no one likes to talk about. These weapons also expose something deeply uncomfortable, the erosion of elite dominance. The Goedendag, Morning Star, and simple maces empowered common soldiers. They required less training, less refinement, and less cost than swords. In mass formations, they were devastating. This shift terrified the aristocracy. For centuries, knights justified their status through martial superiority. When farmers and townsmen began killing armored elites with cheap, effective tools, that justification weakened. So the narrative adjusted. Chivalry was emphasized. Duels were romanticized. Weapons of disruption were quietly sidelined. Not because they were insignificant, but because they were too significant. Forgotten doesn't mean lost. Many of these weapons survived in modified forms. The principles they embodied, force concentration, armor bypass, biomechanical exploitation, never vanished. They evolved into polearms, into early firearms, into modern blunt force and armor-piercing design. What disappeared was not the technology, but the acknowledgement that medieval people understood systems, constraints, and trade-offs far better than we credit them for. They were not primitive. They were pragmatic. The pattern repeats. This is not just a story about weapons. It is a story about how societies forget inconvenient knowledge. When something challenges a preferred narrative, whether about heroism, progress, or identity, it gets reframed, minimized, or erased. The Middle Ages become dark, even as they quietly solve problems with ruthless clarity. The forgotten weapons are evidence. They prove that medieval warfare was not naive or romantic. It was adaptive, data-driven, and brutally honest about what worked. And that forces us to ask one final question. What other medieval knowledge did we discard? Not because it failed, but because it worked too well. That question will take us to the final part. By now, the pattern should be impossible to ignore. Medieval people did not cling to tradition when it failed. They did not worship weapons for their beauty. They observed results and changed accordingly, which makes the final disappearance of these weapons even more revealing. They weren't forgotten because they were ineffective. They were forgotten because they exposed truths society preferred to bury when knowledge becomes inconvenient. The 5 weapons you've just encountered share a common philosophy. They remove illusion. They strip away the fantasy of fair fights, noble clashes, and elegant victory. Instead, they reveal warfare as a problem of systems, materials versus bodies, energy versus biology, morale versus fear. This kind of thinking is dangerous to myths. A sword can be romanticized. A war hammer cannot. A duel can be painted as honor. A crushed ribcage beneath intact armor cannot. So history performed a quiet edit. Weapons that reinforced hierarchy and identity remained in memory. Weapons that democratized violence, undermined elite dominance, and exposed the cold logic of survival faded from storytelling. Not erased from use, erased from narrative. The medieval mind was not primitive. It was empirical. One of the greatest misconceptions about the Middle Ages is that innovation waited for the modern world. In reality, medieval warfare shows rapid iteration driven by direct feedback. Armor improves. Cutting fails. Cutting fails. Blunt force rises. Blunt force spreads. Formations adapt. Formations adapt. Social order shifts. This is systems thinking, long before the term existed. The Bec de Corbin is not crude. It is designed. The Goedendag is not simple. It is strategic. The Morning Star is not barbaric. It is optimized. These weapons represent applied experimentation under extreme constraints, and that is precisely why they feel uncomfortable to modern audiences raised on sanitized versions of the past. What we lose. When we forget. When we forget these weapons, we don't just lose artifacts. We lose evidence that medieval people understood biomechanics, proof that technology reshapes social structures, awareness that progress is often ugly before it is accepted. We also lose humility, because if people without modern science could analyze armor, bodies, morale, and materials this effectively, what other primitive knowledge might we be underestimating? The past doesn't only contain superstition. It contains answers we stopped asking for. The final irony. Today, modern weapon design quietly echoes medieval logic. Blunt trauma remains central in riot control and non-lethal weapons. Armor-piercing focuses on force concentration. Military doctrine prioritizes disruption and morale over kill counts. The principles never vanished. Only the credit did. A different way to see the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages were not an era waiting to be rescued by Enlightenment. They were an era solving problems with the tools available, sometimes brutally, sometimes brilliantly, always honestly. The 5 forgotten weapons are proof. They tell us that when survival is on the line, beauty is optional, that myths collapse under pressure, and that knowledge doesn't disappear because it's wrong. It disappears because it works in ways we don't like to remember. The real loss is not that these weapons faded from memory. The real loss is that we stopped listening to what they were trying to teach us.